you have your Bibles, you could go ahead and join me in Matthew chapter 10. Matthew 10, we spent some time last week introducing a series of thoughts that we have entitled Our Mission. And the reason that we decided to go in that direction as we concluded our study of the New Testament book by book was that there was an overwhelming emphasis, an overwhelming evidence of this push to take what we knew from those apostles and inspired writers to share it with others who didn't. That's what Peter and Paul and Luke and John and others would encourage their audience to do. That when they heard the message of Jesus and its transforming, liberating power, you take that and share it with someone else. And so I thought that it would be appropriate for us for a few weeks to consider together this passage from Matthew 10 that I think focuses or showcases very well the mission that you and I have to accomplish. Last week we looked at verses 1 through 15 where Jesus called those disciples, the original 12, and he sent them out with this mission to share the gospel of Jesus. And he acknowledged that there would be responses that they would receive when they took that mission seriously, that some would respond positively and some would respond negatively, but nonetheless their message, their job, their mission was to share the gospel of Jesus with others. As you move into verse 16, you see this warning that Jesus gives, though, that as someone who has taken seriously the obligation or the duty of sharing the gospel of Jesus, you must know that there will be opposition. Not just opposition in the sense that someone won't listen to what you have to say, that they'll reject what you have to say, but there just might be people that literally are trying to oppose you, that they are presenting themselves as sheep, but under their clothing they are wolves. They're ravenous wolves, Jesus would say on some occasion, that are looking to destroy and kill and harm those who are taking seriously the message of Jesus. Now for us, we read Matthew 10, 16 through about verse 25, and it's like, well, maybe it's a little different. I guess we convince ourselves that the consequences aren't so drastic or harmful nowadays, at least in the Western world, because nobody's killing us for our faith. Nobody's killing us if we take the message of Jesus to the world. But in some sense, we understand. We understand the opposition of what it means for us, or the response to what it means if we carry our faith into the world, especially even in our community, right? The political climate of today. If you take Jesus into our community, you will undoubtedly be met with someone who is opposing you. And to the point where they might be angry and they might say some things. They might even be moved to do something physically. I'm not sure. But the point that Jesus was making is you don't be afraid to carry the gospel message, even in the face of the possibility of physical harm and persecution. And I know that Jesus was telling his disciples to not be afraid, because when you get to verses 26 through 31, Jesus says it 3 times. Connor read for us a moment ago, Matthew 10, 26 through 31. And at the beginning of that reading, at the end of the reading, and right sandwiched in the middle of the reading are 3 reminders from Jesus that are the same. Maybe they're worded a little different depending on which translation you read, but you might see the phrase, do not be afraid, don't fear, or fear not. Let's read together, Matthew 10, 26. Therefore, don't be afraid of them, since there is nothing covered that won't be uncovered, and nothing hidden that won't be made known. What I tell you in the dark, say in the light. What you hear in a whisper, proclaim from the rooftops. Don't fear or be afraid of those who kill the body but are not able to kill the soul. Rather, fear him who is able to destroy both body and soul in hell. Aren't 2 sparrows sold for a penny, yet not one of them falls to the ground without your Father's consent, but even the hairs on your head have been counted. So don't be afraid. You are worth more than the sparrows. In verse 26, Jesus opens the section, the conclusion of his discourse in sending his disciples out. Don't be afraid. In verse 28, the reminder is the same. Don't be afraid. And in verse 31, the reminder is the same. Don't be afraid. It's easy to trace the outline maybe, or at least the thought process of Jesus when he was sending his disciples out. If you look at those verses and you look at the phrases, don't be afraid or don't fear, it's not hard to trace what Jesus was thinking, or at least what he was saying or communicating to his disciples by sending them out with this message in mind. I know that there are wolves. I know that this is dangerous. I know that it puts you in an uncomfortable situation, but these are reasons that you don't have to fear. These are reasons that you don't have to be afraid. Number one, because the truth will win. God's truth will win. You can always count on the fact that what is revealed or what's hidden, it will be revealed. The things that people are doing behind the scenes, that are whispering and all behind, all of that will be shouted from the rooftops. That's what Jesus says, Matthew 10:26. All of those things that are done in the secret, they'll be brought out to the light. You have to know and understand that no one's going to be able to hide. Everything will be revealed. God's truth is going to win. Don't be afraid, right? What about this, number two? Jesus, why would you tell the disciples, don't be afraid? Well, because God is greater than anything man can do to us. That's what he says in verse number 28. All they can do is kill us. That's all they can do. Now, I know that sounds bad. All they can do is kill us, Ty. That means my life is done. That means they hurt my physical body. I'm not ready to die yet. Literally, all man can do is kill you. That's the worst they can do. And so Jesus says, why would you fear a man whose power ends at the grave? Why would you fear a man whose power ends at the grave? God can bring life back from the grave. God has proven it over and over again, and he's told us there's life beyond the grave. So why fear a man whose power ends there? Don't be afraid, Jesus says. Why, Jesus? Because God is greater than anything man can do to you. Or this, Jesus, why would we not be afraid? Because God takes special care of you. Like in verse number 31, when he talks about the sparrows, and if God does so much for the lowly sparrow, the little meek sparrow, if God does so much for them, imagine what he does for us. Why be afraid? Well, it's a good question, I guess, if you look at those verses. Why be afraid? But it's easier said than done. The answer in answering the question, why not be afraid, I guess it's harder to do than we think. Maybe it's easy just looking at those three things. I mean, you can trace the argument pretty clearly, but it's hard to embrace that because of what we know to be true. I'd like to dive in a little bit deeper maybe to Matthew 10:26 through 31 this morning, on the heels of the discussion where Jesus addresses the fact that there will be danger, sending you out into the world to do what Jesus wants us to do, to go take the message into the world. It's not going to be easy. It will bring opposition. It will be difficult. Why can I do this without being afraid? How can I do a better job in this current climate of carrying my mission to the world and sharing Jesus with others? These are three things that bring me comfort and allow me to do that. Number one this morning, I need to know that God cares about the things that we don't notice. And you look at the text and you see the details that are mentioned. Particularly, your mind is drawn to the sparrows, where Jesus constantly reminded his disciples that God cared for the sparrows, that God had his eye on the sparrows, and that God cared more about us or his people than he did the sparrows. And so you have to start to think maybe what Jesus was trying to drive home in the minds of the Jews. And these are some of the things that come out. And sometimes you look at maybe the first one and you think, well, God cares about the things that we don't notice. How does that correlate with not being afraid? The more that I started to learn about the sparrows, I was impressed to learn about how the wording contributed even more to that phrase, don't be afraid, which is why I tried to categorize them the way that we did. Why can you and I not be afraid to live out the name of Jesus in our lives, to carry out our mission in the world we live in? Because God notices or cares about the things that we don't notice. Look back at verse 29 and read them carefully. Aren't two sparrows, Jesus says, sold for a penny? Yet not one of them falls to the ground without your Father's consent. If you look at any commentary or any sort of literature that involves first century lifestyle, especially first century commerce, you'll notice that sparrows are among the most humble of birds, that anybody could afford a sparrow, basically. That was actually set aside by God under the old covenant, that if you couldn't afford a lamb and you couldn't afford some goat or sheep to offer, that you could offer a sparrow and it would be acceptable, that anybody would be able to present present an offering to God because anybody could buy a sparrow. They were literally almost worthless. Jesus says you could buy 2 of them for just a penny, and a whole $1 of them would get you a massive bag of them. I mean, they were nothing. They were worth absolutely nothing. And so anybody could present an offering to God. And maybe that's why God did it that way, because God is easily accessible by all, and anyone, even if they had nothing, could buy a sparrow and present it to God. But in one sense, you take that idea and see how worthless that sparrow is in the grand scheme of things. You see how little value it carries, yet the attention that Jesus places on the sparrow in the eyes of God, to the point that says he watches it. He's watching it as it falls, that he doesn't even fall to the ground without the Father's consent. I guess sometimes I've taken away from that verse, at least verse 29, or maybe the whole section as a whole, and I think about this sparrow falling, and I guess maybe the temptation is to come away from these verses by just this understanding that God is watching the sparrow as it falls. And maybe you get that from that old gospel song where it says his eye is on the sparrow, and I know he watches me. And so maybe we just think that when we read Matthew 10, 26 through 31, the idea is the sparrow falls and God saw it the whole time. And that's true, I guess. God did see the sparrow fall. His eye is on it the whole time. But what this verse to me is teaching is a lot more than that. There's something more that I can grasp that comes from Matthew 10, 29, more than just God having his eye on the sparrow, and that's that the sparrow didn't fall at random. God willed it to happen. He even says it right there in the text. Not one of them falls to the ground without your Father's consent. There are 2 implications that I think are pretty important as it pertains to understanding our mission and why we shouldn't be afraid to carry it out, because God cares about the things we don't notice. And implication number 1 is this: sparrows do fall. That means that every now and then, or maybe you could even say something like this: even the little sparrows fall to the ground eventually. Every one of them, not just every now and then sparrows will fall. Every sparrow will fall eventually, right? That when Jesus says the sparrows fall, but it doesn't happen without the Father's consent, he's acknowledging that sooner or later troubles will fall on every sparrow. Just like you and I know when we read the scriptures that sooner or later troubles will fall on every one of us. That eventually it will happen. There's no way to get around it. It's inevitable. Troubles will happen in our lives. And so when Jesus presents this to the disciples and he says, listen, God cares about the things you don't notice, by pointing out the sparrows and the fact that they're falling, he isn't just saying that God is watching you when he sends you out in this world with danger. God willed that you would go out in this danger, and he's watching you knowing that you will fall prey to the danger. He's watching you knowing what happened. God sent the disciples out knowing that Stephen would be killed the way that he did. God sent him out, John out, knowing that John would be exiled to Patmos. He sent Paul out knowing that Paul would be beaten and spit on and cussed at. He knew all of that. Jesus knew all of that when he was sending these disciples out. God willed it to happen, knowing that eventually those things would happen. Now, I guess the problem is the fact that usually our thoughts of Christianity, or sometimes maybe what we've made ourselves think is, if I just become a Christian, then that means that nothing like that's going to happen. That's the way I guarantee that no problems will happen in my life. If I'll just follow Jesus, everything's going to be okay. But we've learned real quickly, if you follow Jesus, that what happens in the world happens to us too, right? We lose our jobs. We get sick. We run out of money sometimes. Our family, we find ourselves in some bad situations. We get the calls from the doctors. We get ripped off. Death touches our families as Christians just like it does to people in the world. No matter how hard you try, you can't avoid it. Sparrows fall. That's it. That's implication number 1. Implication number 2, though, when we're thinking about God caring about the things we don't notice, I can't help but be drawn to the fact that God knew it would happen. That the text says God willed it to happen. God willed that the sparrow would fall. Now, it takes a high view of God. It takes a high view of God to admit that everything that happens according to his counsel and decree. That everything that happens in life is either caused by God or allowed by Him. It takes a high view of God to admit that everything happening, God is aware of, that every sparrow that falls, every trouble that happens is a part of God's providential oversight of what's going on the earth. That includes all of our suffering and all of our pain and all of our loss and all of our heartache. And it's really hard to admit that, and it takes a high view of God to do it. That it's really hard for me, I'll admit, to accept that what Paul says in Romans 8:28 is true, that all things work together for the good of those who love the Lord and are called according to His purpose. When I'm hurting, it's hard to believe that. When I'm struggling, it's hard to believe that. When I'm discouraged, it's hard to believe that. When things are happening to me and my family, it's hard to believe that. It's hard to understand and grasp how God is working and what His plan is. And even when I look at His plan, I only see a small part of it, and what little bit I do see doesn't make sense to me. God's providence is hard to grasp, and it's hard to put my hands on, but I've learned, I guess, that it really depends on where you start in your thinking. If you have a problem, if you have a struggle, if you have a heartache, if you have a pain, whatever it is that's burdening your heart, the trouble that you're facing that God knew was going to happen because He providentially sees and knows everything that happens in our lives, even to the things that we don't care about or notice. If I start with my trouble and I try to reason back to God, I'll never get there. How many of you have done that? You're looking at your problem, it's so big, and all you can see is your problem, and you're trying to figure out how to get out of it, but the only thing you can see is your problem. And you're trying to get back to God, but you just can't do it because the only thing you see is your problem. What about if you start with God and work to your problem? What about the first move I make is, God, how can I fix this problem? How can you help me in this problem? God, what am I missing so that I can fix this problem? How can I deal with what's happening in front of me? If I start with God and I work to my problem, seems like all things usually work out. From the fall of a raindrop to the fall of an empire, God is over it all. He sees every bit of it. Everything that happens is under His providential care. And I promise you that your heart will be most satisfied when you seek to discern God's will in everything. When you look for God's aim, God's hand, God's fingerprints in everything, that's when your heart will be the most satisfied. It makes me rest and comforted to know that God left me with a mission, and I don't have to be afraid of what happens around me or to me, because God cares about the things that I don't notice, even down to the smallest, humble, most little detail in my life. That God cares so intimately about that motivates me to do my mission. But then you move into verse number 30 in our text, and you see that God cares about the smallest detail of our lives, not just the things that we don't notice, things that, it's like God knew we were going to fall. God knew that was going to happen. And we don't notice that sometimes. We don't pay attention to how God's at work in our life. But then you read on in the text and you get to verse 30 where He says, but even the hairs of your head have all been counted. And it lets me in on another facet of God's care and motivating me not to be afraid. Now, I don't remember ever a time where I sat down and thought, you know what, I'm going to count the hairs on someone's head. I've never done that before. Maybe I didn't do it because I just don't want to dig through somebody else's hair, or I don't think you could do it. I don't know. Maybe it wouldn't be easy to count the hairs on somebody's head. I know that the average human head, according to Google, has about 100,000 strands of hair. I know that Google said that there are about 50 strands of your hair that fall out every day without you trying. You don't have to do anything. 50 strands are going to fall out. I learned that it varies by hair color. If you're naturally blonde, then you have an average of 140,000 strands of hair. If you're naturally a brunette, you have 100,000 strands of hair approximately. If you're a redhead, you have somewhere around 90,000 strands of hair. It's just crazy. I didn't know all this stuff about hair until I started looking into this. And all that's cool, I guess, maybe something cool to know, but I doubt any of us have ever spent any significant time to thinking about how many hairs an average person has. I really don't ever think about my hair other than when my wife, my mom, or my grandma either sees or watches the live stream and says, you need to get your hair cut. That's really about the only time I think about my hair, when someone says that. I mean, I just don't. We don't think about it a whole lot. Never grabbed a singular hair and thought, man, I wonder how 620 made it out of my head today. Just don't do that, right? I don't think about it that way. I don't think about it that way, and I don't think you do. I want you to think for a second, though, about verse 30. Even the hairs of your head have all been counted. Now, and I started to think about that as I was writing out my thoughts and I was writing out my notes, and I'm looking out about, at several of us today, and it's like, that's 100,000 for me. That's 100,000 for Heidi. That's 100,000 for Brandon, that's 100,000 for, well, not for Wesley, 100,000 for Ray, right? That's 100,000 for Ray. That's 100,000 for Brandon, and 100,000 for Eli, and 100,000 for Dina, and 100,000 for Leslie. And I mean, we could go on and on. We're almost to 1 million right there, just as we're adding it up. And we could go on and just think about how many millions of hairs are present in this place right now. And Matthew 10 and verse 30 says God knows every one of them, every single one of them. Millions and billions of hairs, and God knows every single one of them. And to me, the meaning of that is evidently clear. If God cares so much about the things that matter so little to me, things that I've probably never even given any concern about, think about how much He cares about the things that matter so much more. Think about how much time and space that those things occupy in the heart of God that really actually matter so much more. That if God really does know how many hairs are on the top of my head, then how much He cares about the things that really I'm struggling with in my life. That all the pain that I'm carrying in my heart, how intimately God must know that if He does know how much hair is on my head, or how much hair is on all of our heads if God knows all of those problems. One of my favorite passages in the Scripture to study from time to time, and I wish we had time to dive into it this morning, but we don't. It's a bulk of Scripture in Genesis 37 through 50. And you have to know how that plays into what Jesus says in Matthew 10, I believe, because when you start to look through Joseph's life, I think you see Matthew 10, 26 through 31 in action. How you have a man who endured severe persecution, who endured severe physical experiences and consequences, a man who was sold by his family and betrayed, a man who was constantly tested in his faith. And if you just went through his life and asked a series of questions that would zero in on the way that it had to have happened exactly the way God wanted it to be orchestrated, or else none of this would have ever worked the way that it did. If this was left up to chance or happenstance, if God wasn't in control of every single tiny detail, Joseph's story wouldn't end up the way that it did. That you could look at every question and ask, why did Jacob want to send Joseph in the first place? Why were Jacob's brothers in a different location? Why did the Ishmaelites come along at that moment? Why were they in the mood to purchase a slave? How did he end up in Egypt? How did the cupbearer and the baker end up in prison with him? Why did Pharaoh forget his dreams? I mean, all of these things that happened to Joseph, it had to have happened in that particular way. God was in control of every moment. And for us, it seems like, well, it might just be unconnected. Maybe it was a coincidence that all of those things happened the way that they did, but it couldn't have been that way. Nothing was happenstance or chance with God. God has to be seen in the little things, as He is in Genesis 37 through 50, as He is in Matthew 10, 30. The God of the large is also the God of the small, and that's important. The God who hung the stars in space, who created all of the galaxies and all of the universes, is the same God who numbers the hairs on our head. God is in control. God cares about the little details. That motivates me to move on with my mission because God cares so much about those things. Here's this, verse 31. So don't be afraid. You are worth more than many sparrows. I find it interesting. That's the way that Jesus chose to conclude those verses. It starts with don't be afraid because the sparrows, and it concludes with don't be afraid, you're worth more than the sparrows. And you read verse 30 and you think, okay, what does that have to do with trouble? You say, God cares about us even when trouble comes. You read verse 30, don't be afraid because you're worth more than the sparrows. How do the two things fit together? The heart of the issue is this. The sparrows are worth nothing, right? We've already acknowledged that. They're worth so little, yet God cares so deeply for each one of them. Not just does He watch them fall, He knew that they would fall. He knew every second of their falling, what caused it, what happened as a result of it. God was there and present for them all. As deeply as God cares about that, so deeply as He cares about numbering each individual strand of hair on all of our heads, think about how much more worth that we carry. Infinitely more than the little sparrow. Infinitely more than the amount of care or attention that God gives to numbering the hairs on our head. How do I know that Jesus loves us infinitely more than the sparrows? Because He didn't die for the sparrows. because he didn't die for the sparrows. He didn't die for them. He died for us. And his blood is a badge of proof. It's a badge of honor. It's a badge of understanding and acknowledging the amount of worth that Jesus and God placed on you and I as humans. So what does that do for me then? What is understanding how much more valuable and worthy I am to God than the sparrows? What does that do for me as far as my mission is concerned? Number one, it makes me bold in times of trouble. How do I know God cares about me when trouble comes? Because he died for me. He gave his life for me. So what does that do in turn for me? How does it motivate me to not be afraid? It makes me bold in times of trouble. Paul said in Romans 8 and verse 31, if God is for us, who can be against us? And that was his mission statement. That's what made him go. That's what kept the cross on the forefront of his mind. Because of what God did for me, no one can stop me. No one can keep me from doing what I need to do because God's on my side. The answer to his question in Romans 8 and verse 31 is no one, nothing. Nothing could be against him because God was for him. The second thing knowing that God died for us, which motivates us in turn to have confidence in moments of confusion. There are a lot of things that make us uncertain today, right? So many outlets of truth, so many opinions, so many thoughts, so many ideas, not even really sure who to trust, not even really sure what's right anymore. In some ways, I guess we have more questions than we do answers about some things because of all of the opinions. And there's a lot of times where I really feel like we're just kind of stumbling through the dark, not knowing what's in front of us. Like that's just the way it feels with everything that's in front of us in this moment. One day, everything that God has given us, everything that he said, everything that we have in front of us, all of that will be proved right. And right now, I guess the job that we have to do is just trust that in moments of confusion and in moments of uncertainty and in moments of not really knowing what's right, there's one thing I can trust that will be proved right again and again, as it already has, and it's God. It's God and his word. It's what's leading us. It's what's guiding us. It's what's encouraging us and sustaining us. That even when everything else seems so confusing, I can be sure that God cares for me and he's given me things that leads me in the right way. And then this, I know that it gives me hope in times of sorrow. I thought about this yesterday when I was sitting right here on the front row and we were remembering the life of Miss Alice. So many good memories that I heard shared, even that I shared with Miss Alice over the 6 years that I've been here. And I just remember that. I remember all of the stories that she gave us and all of the good things. And while I remembered that, I looked around the room as we spoke or as we interacted, and you saw people with tears in their eyes, that there was sorrow in their heart because they've lost someone they love. How can we not do that, right? How can we not weep for the people that we love? But God says over and over again, be of good cheer, right? We sang, no tears in heaven. Why? Why? Because God has death in his hands. John says in Revelation that Jesus holds the keys of death in his hands, that even death has no power over God. I think about those verses, Matthew 10, 29, 30, and 31. And sometimes I guess I just need to be reminded, like, it's one of those things where I'm so scared to walk to the deer stand in the dark. It's like, it's just a miserable feeling when you're walking to the deer stand by yourself in the dark, especially when you're bow hunting. You don't have a gun. You just got your bow. You don't know what's going to attack you or anything. But then I get to the deer stand. I think about how many hundreds of times I've walked to the deer stand and never been attacked by a mountain lion or something. It's okay. I just remember that. I think back and I'm like, look, I'm good. I can do this. I've done it more than once. It's okay. It's going to happen. And sometimes I just need to remind myself, don't be afraid. Don't do it. You've done this. You know what happens. You know where you're going. You know what's in front. You know it. Don't be afraid. And Jesus would remind his disciples, don't be afraid. You know what's in front of you. God is in front of you. You know what's behind you. God's behind you. Know that you'll be pressed in and shaken in from every side, that there will be people that try to hurt you. Don't be afraid. You know what's in front of you. God's in front of you. Don't be afraid. Even down to the tiniest detail, the moments in life that you can't fathom, God is in control of them all. I know you've heard this story before, but I thought I would remind you. In 1871, there was a man who had lost everything in a fire in Chicago, killed over 300 people. There were hundreds of people that were left homeless because of this great fire. There was a man, a lawyer in Chicago at the time. His name was Horatio Spafford, lost all kinds of stuff in the fire. As a result of that, he decided that he was going to send his family across the sea over to England, was going to let them live there for a time, participate in some evangelistic crusade campaign type things, and he had to finish some some business in Chicago as a result of the fire, and he was going to join them later. He put his wife and 4 daughters on a ship, sent them across the sea to England. They didn't make it. About halfway across in November of 1871, they were hit by another ship, and the ship was destroyed. Much of the passengers, or many of the passengers on the ship, they lost their lives that day. The wife made it. She was able to be saved and taken to Wales, I think it was, where she contacted her husband with this message: saved alone. That all 4 of his daughters had suffered in that shipwreck. He got on a ship and he was headed over there to meet his wife to make sure that she was okay as quickly as he could on the next ship. And as they were passing over the spot on the graph where this ship had come to rest, where his daughters' lives were taken, they radioed to him in his cabin and told him that that was the spot where his daughters had lost their lives. He sat down in his cabin at the table and he wrote words that you and I have sang no telling how many times in our lives at church. He says this: when peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my lot, thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul. Though Satan should buffet, though trials should come, let this blessed assurance control, that Christ hath regarded my helpless estate, and had shed his own blood for my soul. And undoubtedly, thinking about the days where he'd see his 4 daughters again, he said, and Lord, haste the day when my faith will be sight. The clouds be rolled back as a scroll. The trump shall resound, and the Lord shall descend. Even so, it is well with my soul. I thought about those words and that story, and I'm confident in saying that those are the words of a man who rested in the rock-solid providence of God. That he could say something like, it is well with my soul. My soul is well because God is in every detail. Because God is in every detail, even in the hardest tragedies of my life. And acknowledging that doesn't make the pain any easier. It doesn't take away the sting of the pain, but it does give me a way to keep believing that even though I am a sheep among wolves, even though I'm in an uncomfortable situation, there is no conceivable situation that I'll ever experience in my life where it isn't safe to trust God in every detail in the toughest situations. Maybe you're here this morning and you're not a Christian and you're dealing with an unconceivable situation. You think there's no way I've ever experienced anything like this. Sin has got you in such a bad predicament that you're miserable and you're hurting and you're in pain, and you think there's no way out of this. There is no conceivable situation where it's unsafe to trust God. Why not give your life to him this morning? Why not let him be the God of all the details? You quit trying to handle all of it. Let him be the God of all the details. Let him save your soul, transform your life. Obey the gospel of Jesus this morning. Or maybe you are a Christian, and maybe the reason that you've not taken your mission seriously is because you've seen all the reasons you have to be afraid. Maybe you really don't know what to do about all of the uncertainty, all the confusion. Or maybe you are worried about something someone's going to say to you. Or maybe you are worried about something someone's going to do to you. Put all of that fear aside. Look realistically at the expectations from God. I've given so much to you. All I'm asking you to do is give that to someone else. Don't be afraid to do it. I'm with you in every detail. Trust your heart to God this afternoon or this morning. Why not do that while you have an opportunity as we stand and as we sing?